As I mentioned earlier, today's scripture reading is the final of the stories of the prophet Elisha that we have been reading. And it really is a story that has three distinct parts to it. So what I'd like to do today is, instead of reading you the story, is to tell you the story as part of my sermon. And if you're a stickler for the truth, there is the reference in your bulletin. You can always look it up and read it for yourself in case I left out any of the good parts. But I want to tell it in three different parts because this story is something that I would call a constitutive story for our identity. So as the people of Israel are growing up as children, this is one of the stories that they hear, and it's one of the stories that answers the question, who are we? Who are we and how do we live before God? How does God live before us? It's one of those kinds of stories, and we'll reflect on that toward the end of the story. So the first part of the story begins like this. The king of Aram. Aram is this powerful nation north of Israel, what we today call Syria. And it's a nation that has an incredible army, and the king of Aram is just flummoxed. He doesn't know how things are happening the way they are because he'll be in with his council, and they'll come up with a plan on how to attack Israel. And they'll say that we'll attack this village over here, or we'll set up this camp over here. And just as soon as the little raiding army goes out to attack that village, they'll find all the villagers had already fled and are over in the next village. Somehow they knew. Or they're going over here to set up camp, and they'll find that the one and only pathway to that area has already been blocked off, and they can't get through with their horses and their carriages and all of that. And the king is just beside himself because the story will tell us that Aram is at war with Israel. And when it says that, it's probably not a full-scale war like a Lord of the Rings sort of grandeur, with thousands and thousands, but more like raiding parties from this bully up north that comes down and raids a village and takes away all of their good meat and whatever wealth they might have, takes it back to Aram, and you never know when Aram is going to strike. And it leaves the people, particularly in the northern part of Israel, in constant peril, constant worry about when the enemy is coming. But in this story, the king of Aram is just flummoxed because they already seem to know. And he can't figure out how it is that the people of Israel can anticipate not just his thoughts, but his plans, the things, the story will tell us, that he even whispers in his bedchamber. They already seem to know. So, of course, the king of Aram imagines that he's got a spy in his inner circle. And he begins to explore that and to see who it might be so he can root them out. And one of them says, "Sir, it's not us. There's no spy here. We're not the problem. There's a prophet in Israel. His name is Elisha. And everything we plan here, he knows there. And he knows what we're up to, and he's the one telling the king of Israel, and the king of Israel is responding before we can even act." So the king of Aram gets angry and says, "We're going to take care of Elisha." And he puts together this mighty army, bigger than just a raiding group, a big army of chariots and horses, the story is quick to tell us. And under the cover of night, they go to a city called Dothan, where the prophet Elisha lives. And that's the end of the first part of the story. So you can see now it's a story that's about our enemies, and our enemies are comically goofy, right? They're incapable of doing the things we fear the most. And it's one of those stories that makes us feel better about ourselves and better than our enemies. And the one thing I want to point out about this story, because we're going to circle back to it later, is that the king of Israel has been involved, but not because he's any great strategist or leader himself. He's just smart enough to listen to the prophet. So the second part of the story begins the next morning. Elisha has a servant whose role, as many servants would be to get up first thing in the morning, go fetch a pail of water, get the water boiling, the fires going, all those kinds of things that have to be ongoing by the time the house begins to wake up. And the servant goes out and he looks up. And all along the hillside surrounding the city of Dothan, he sees the great army of Aram. Horses, chariots, soldiers, everywhere he looks. And he cries out to warn the house, "Alas, master, what shall we do?" Because they're just surrounded by this army. And Elisha, I don't know if he's sleepy or if this was just his demeanor, but he takes it all in stride and says, it's all right. There are more of us than there are of them. And this poor little servant looking around the city of Dothan, wondering, there's a bunch of old people and children and, non-warriors here. This can't be a good thing. And Elisha prays. This is the first of 3 prayers that he says in the second part of the story. And all 3 of them are about sight. And Elisha prays, "Lord, open his eyes so he can see." And the servant looks out, and not only does he see the army of Aram along the hillside, but among that army and behind that army and surrounding that army, he sees the army of the Lord, not just with horses and chariots, but with horses and chariots of fire. I don't know what to do with that. I don't tend to take things like that literally. It sounds to me like it's just a way of saying there's a powerful army of God. And the servant sees it. And we should note that it's been there all along. He just now has eyes to see that the army of the Lord is there. And it fills him with confidence. But then the army of Aram starts to descend down the hill to strike. And they start coming down the hill, and this must have been a massive sight. And by the way, even though there's an army of the Lord with fiery chariots and horses, they actually don't do any fighting in this story. There must be eye candy or something like that for the story, because they're there, but they don't get involved. And now the army of Aram starts to come down the hill toward this tiny city of Dothan where Elisha is. And Elisha says his second prayer. Another one about sight. "Lord, blind their eyes so they can't see." And suddenly the army is blinded. I imagine it means the soldiers, not the horses, but there's great confusion there because they can't see what they're doing. And suddenly the army is blinded, and Elisha walks out and says, "Hey, this is not the place you're looking for. This isn't the city you're looking for. Follow me, and I'll get you there." And Elisha starts to lead the army of Aram away from Dothan somewhere else. Years ago, I was on a horseback ride in the rural mountains of Virginia. And the guy leading the ride began yodeling. He began yodeling because he wanted all of us strung out in this long path going around the mountains to be able to hear him. And it was just amazing how yodeling is not just some weird southern quirky thing, but it's the way mountain people would communicate. Because no matter where we were going up that mountain, we could hear the sound of yodeling coming off the hills. So when I hear this story, I think Elisha's yodeling. I mean, he could be carrying a flag, but they're blind. They can't follow him if he's carrying a flag. So at this point in the story, I hear Elisha just kind of yodeling, right? Leading them from Dothan away, and the soldiers blinded on their horses with chariots following the sound that they hear from Elisha. And he leads them from the city of Dothan to Samaria, which is the capital of Israel. A walled city, a strong city, a city that they were not ready to fight, a city they were not equipped to fight. And Elisha takes them to Samaria, and they enter the gates. And now the whole army of Aram is inside the city walls of Samaria, and Elisha prays his third prayer. Lord, now open their eyes so they can see. And the army of Aram, suddenly their eyes are open, and they realize that they are done for. Because here they are in the capital city of Israel, surrounded by Israel's entire army. And here they are, unprepared for that, and they're caught. And that's how the second part of the story ends. And we notice that within that second part of the story, Elisha had 3 prayers: open his eyes, close their eyes, open their eyes. Because this is all about being able to see what is around us. Now, as a story and as a formative story, so far, a story that forms our identity, this is a perfect kind of a national myth. You see how the enemy is described as being pretty much incapable of doing what they love to do the most and the thing we hate the most. They're incapable of doing it. And we have God on our side. And because God is on our side, no matter how strong and fierce they might be, because God is on our side, in the end, we win. And that's how this second part of the story ends, is you have a very typical national story that affirms all of our presumptions that we're the good guys, they are the bad guys, God is on our side, and as a result, no matter how fearsome they might be, we're going to win. But then we come to the third part of the story. And this is when the king of Israel reemerges. Now, the king of Israel, you can imagine, he's just salivating here. He's got this army, an army that's been pestering and genuinely bedeviling the northern part of Israel for some time now. He's got them right where he wants them. They're caught within his city walls. They can't get away. They're outnumbered. He can decimate the Aramean army right there. It's almost like killing fish in a barrel. It's that simple. He's got them caught there, and he runs out and he says to Elisha, "Father, can I kill them? Can I kill them?" Because this is what we do in our national stories. When we finally end up on top and our enemies are smoked, we defeat them, and that proves that God is on our side and we were the good people all along. And the king of Israel wants this to be that kind of story. And Elisha says, no. And it's more than no. It's rather eloquent. Did you, with your strategies and your armies, did you defeat them? Did you bring them here? Everyone knows that the king of Israel had nothing to do with that. So Elisha says, no, you can't kill them. Instead, feed them. And give them something to drink. And then send them on their way. And I'll give the king of Israel this much credit. To his credit, he listened. And he gave them a feast, this army of Aram, the enemy. Right where we want them, he gave them a feast, and he brought them fine wine, and they were filled, and they were happy, and they were feted. And then they opened the gates and said, you're free to go. Didn't take their swords, didn't take their horses, didn't take their chariots, didn't strip them of any gold, didn't humiliate them. They feted them and opened the doors and bade them goodbye. And the story ends by saying that they returned to Aram, and from that day forward, the Aramean army no longer attacked Israel. Now, if we hear this story as one of those formative stories that shapes our identity by telling us who we are in God's world, what it means to live in our world with God, we can see this very different than most of our national stories. Very different from most of our communal stories, and frankly, it's very different from most of our personal stories. Where in our stories, God is obviously on our side, those who are against us are obviously wrong, and God will show us that when we have a clear moment. But in this story, Imagine growing up in a community that's shaped by this story. This is what it means to live in God's world, and this is how God's people live. And when our enemies are right where we want them, when we have that opportunity for retribution, revenge, karma, she's a nasty lady sometimes. We have that opportunity for revenge instead of revenge. We feed. Can you imagine that? Because that's exactly what the psalmist was remembering when he wrote, "You prepare a table in the presence of my enemies." That's exactly what motivated the Apostle Paul when he said, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If your enemy is thirsty, give them something to drink. It's exactly the kind of story that shaped the ministry of Jesus. When he said, you've heard it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. We all live according to this law of retribution, but I say to you, if someone slaps you on one cheek, turn the other. And then Jesus goes on to say, anybody can love their friends and hate their enemies. Any old sinner can do that. But I say to you, love your enemies and do good to those who treat you despitefully. That's the kind of character, that's the kind of faith, that's the kind of following God that happens when we hear a story like this and we let it shape our identity. So just imagine what it would be like if the United States, which often likes to imagine ourselves as being a Christian nation, actually were shaped by this story. How much of our history would be different? Maybe that's too much to ask. Just imagine if the Christian church were shaped by this story. And if that were our character. If those so-called peace churches weren't these little tiny churches over here on the side that were a little bit different from everybody else, like the Quakers and so forth, but rather was what the word Christianity meant. Because when we read the scriptures, this is precisely what Christianity means. It means that we are not shaped by these nationalistic, personalistic stories in which we get to wreak revenge because God is on our side, but rather we're shaped by this story that says, if our enemy is hungry, the right response is to feed them. And if they're thirsty, give them something to drink. Because that's the only way of overcoming evil. It's with a greater good. May God make us a Christian church that is shaped by this kind of story. Amen.